Reaching 500 eggs in 100 weeks is not about pushing the bird harder, I would say. It's more about supporting her better along the way.
We should not start supplementing at the point when we see the problems occurring, but start right before to prevent the problem from occurring. And that is in the first weeks of life.
Welcome to Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. Let's dive into the future of poultry nutrition this week. From phytogenic feed additives that support vaccine performance to predicting a hen's laying potential before her first egg. Learn this week how nutrition is reducing antibiotic reliance, improving disease resistance, and boosting production, all while enhancing bird welfare. Joining us are two experts from Trouw Nutrition, Dr. Ellen Hambrecht, Global Product Manager for Phyto Complex Solutions. Dr. Hambrecht brings more than 20 years of experience in research, sustainability, and marketing to the conversation. Also joining us, Dr. Roland Koedijk, Global Head of Poultry Nutrition, who brings 15 plus years of technical innovation and nutritional development to the organization. And together, they're going to share with us how targeted nutritional strategies are shaping the next era of poultry health and productivity. Dr. Koedijk, I want to start with you. If we set a big picture goal for our hens, what does it take for us to reach 500 eggs in 100 weeks of production?
The trend is that laying hens are being kept much longer in production, simply because they can sustain a long production cycle. They are still very capable of producing a high level at the old-fashioned 80 weeks or whatever, wherever you are in the world. You had the typical length of a laying cycle, and that is now progressing, so that's increasing in length because they are still highly productive at that age. But it, of course, comes to a couple of things that need to go well. I would almost say if everything goes well, you can keep them for a very long time. So the 500 eggs in 100 weeks is not a dream anymore. It's real, and it is possible. We see that with all the breeds. We see it in all the areas around the world. So we really see that is the major trend in the egg production where we are today. So it needs to all go well. So they need to, of course, stay healthy. They need to be productive. Feed intake needs to be up to speed. But there's a couple of, I would group it into three categories, if you will, that need to go well. So that has shown improvements over the years. First is genetics. Of course, you need a hen that is capable of sustaining a long production cycle. So breeding companies have selected for longevity, not only for high peak or not only for the classical selection criteria, but longevity has definitely made its way into the selection criteria for breeds. And I would say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? So you need to also have the genetics that is capable of doing that. And all of the breeds that we see around the world, the main breeds, they have very capable hens that can sustain this longer production cycle. It's, of course, an emphasis on production without compromising quality or egg shell quality. Egg size becomes more important also if you keep these hens for a longer period of time, because it still tends to increase a little bit over time. With increasing age, the egg size is increasing also a little bit. So we need to manage egg size a little bit better. Egg-shell quality, like I said, is a very important key metric for keeping hens in longer time. And for the genetics part, we see that also in all the housing systems, it's capable of keeping them longer, and with all the breeds, like I already said. The second group, besides genetics, is management, because you need to have the hen that is capable of sustaining a long production cycle, but also you need to put it in an environment where it can thrive. Right, so it's important that all the factors are of lighting programs, from uniformity, biosecurity, stress reduction measures, all the access to feed, access to water, the quality of water, everything can be grouped in the management bucket, if you will, needs also to be, of course, going well to have an animal that is able to sustain a long productive life. And the last one is, of course, nutrition. That's closer to our heart. Of course, we have a lot of nutritional products. We have a lot of nutritional advice opportunities, and their longevity is a very important factor. So our longevity program, we have tailored it specifically for longer cycles, is very phase specific. We need to have precise nutrient recommendations for specific phases, that the nutrient package that the animal needs in that specific age is also what we feed. So we have an increasing number of phases to make sure that the nutrient input is in the optimal condition. All feeding phases are optimized for extended production cycles. So it starts already with the rearing diets, because a good pullet will create a laying hen that can sustain a long production cycle. So we need to have all the areas of production or of nutritional profiling, or the nutritional levels that we choose need to be specifically for the phases where the use of those nutrients is required. Same accounts for gut health, of course, via fibers, enzymes, additives. Of course, we have internal and we use additives to help us overcome problems. And especially in the liver function and the immunity, those are important areas of attention when we are talking about a long life laying hen. Last is data-driven monitoring, because we need to have the analytics and enable timeline nutritional adjustments. We need to understand what the flock is needing at specific times. So we have a lot more data that's coming in on the flock level that we can use also to optimize the nutritional profiles for that. So to sum it up, reaching 500 hex in 100 weeks is not about pushing the bird harder, I would say. It's more about supporting her better along the way, from hatching moment during the rearing period up to the laying cycle later on, to have the nutrients that it needs in the most optimal way and in the feed intake that it requires.
Yeah, I really like how you frame that. It's not about pushing the bird harder, more this idea of supporting her. It's a somewhat complex system, right? You gave a great overview there. The genetic blueprint, the fuel we're giving her every day to do the job. So I think that's a great way of framing that, the support we're providing her in that longevity puzzle. My follow-up question for you, that is, if we're starting at the beginning of that journey before we get to the 100 weeks, how good is your crystal ball, so to speak, at looking at that hen's long-term productivity before she ever gets into lay? Do we have the ability now to have a good idea before we ever start the runway that she's going to be able to get there?
Yeah, to a certain extent we do. We are getting better at it. So really the prediction of what the animal is going to do in 100 weeks time is very difficult, because it's, of course, as you can understand, it's multifactorial. There's many things that can happen along the way up to that 100-week mark, or whichever longevity mark you set in the future. Of course, they can get sick, or there can be other problems that might not be related to a specific solution that you can take already in the beginning. But we are getting better at it. We know that limiting factors that avoid them getting into high production later, so those you need to avoid, right?
Sure.
And that is, of course, a very important one we see around the world many times, is that hens don't get the target weight that they are supposed to have at point of start of lay or end of rearing, at whatever period you choose, but they come into lay slightly underweight compared to the breed recommendations. That always, I would say, leads to a suboptimal production later on. So those are suboptimal pullets, or a bad quality pullet is not going to turn into a highly productive longevity laying hen. So the rearing, the pressure on the rearing is increasing. Also, if you think about it, over the many years in the past, right, we have seen that the rearing period has slightly shortened. So the hens come into lay slightly earlier than what they did 30 or 50 years ago. On the other hand, the laying cycle is increasing in length. Right. So that pushes more pressure on the rearing period to be successful, so that they can sustain a highly productive, longer laying cycle. So the focus on rearing is important, and that is a make or break moment for laying hens, for advising or expecting production later on.
Get them off on the right foot, we'll have a lot better chance of success in the long run, in other words.
Definitely. Yeah. And if you're healthy, and if you have grown well during the rearing period, and you come into later and you're more robust, the development of the structure has gone in a more optimal way. So not only the bones, but also the muscles, the frame, if you will, of the laying hen has developed in a better way. And it is also generally slightly more resistant for stressors, so that diseases, but it can also be management factors. That can be the transition from rearing into lay is also one of those big change factors in the life of a laying hen, not only in the hormonal part that they change from a juvenile into an adult, but also they start production. They should be able to stay or to get a high level of feed intake. So they need to be able to get those grams in, to be able to get the nutrients in that they're required for good production. So you need to have the transitions from rearing into laying hen that needs to be going very well, and that you can only do with an optimally developed pullet. So yeah, all of it is coming down to a good quality pullet, and that is basically best prediction that you can have right now to, if nothing else goes wrong down the line, disease-wise or in any other factor, you will have the biggest chances of having a highly productive flock, and that can extend the cycle to 100 weeks or more. And so we have looked at what is needed during early development, what is happening in that period, how can we create a diet or a series of diets that can sustain that expectation in the best way so that they are equipped for a long production cycle later.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the nutritional strategies. I want to bring in Dr. Ella Hambrecht here, your colleague, to talk a little bit more about that and some of the research you've done there and products that are on the market. Dr. Hambrecht, we've been having this great conversation about the importance of performance and longevity, trying to get more eggs over a longer period of time. That sounds great. If I'm a producer, I sure like that idea. And I'm curious the role that plant-based feed additives play in that. Roland made a good case about the importance of nutrition. So let's maybe dive a little more specifically into some of the specific pieces of that nutritional puzzle. What are your thoughts on the additive space?
Well, thanks for the question. And yes, obviously, the plant-based additives, they can play a significant role. Mm-hmm. And maybe let's start out by defining what we're actually talking about. And that is the plant-based feed additives. We call them phytocomplexes. They are basically specialized plant metabolites that the plant produces to have a better chance of survival. So they're not essential for its existence, so they're not directly involved in reproduction or growth, but they provide the plant an advantage because, otherwise the plant only produces them whenever there is a benefit for it. Mm-hmm. And that can be to withstand cold, but it can also be, for example, to prevent animals from eating it. And that is basically the reason why those plant metabolites have the possibility to interact with the animal physiology in a meaningful way. And in phytotechnology, we flip that around. So while in nature, it could be that those metabolites have a negative impact. They bitter substances, maybe, Brussels sprouts. So that deters small children from eating them. And in nature, it's the animals that shouldn't eat the plant. But at lower levels, they can have a beneficial effect, actually. So it's all dose depending, and that is what we make use of. So what is really important is obviously to select the right plants and down to the subspecies. So not only I want to work with oregano. No, there is much more to that than only selecting a generic plant, let's say, and to combine them to really make use of these synergistic effects. Coming back to your question about longevity, because that was an excursion into the phytotechnology realm, very important is that to identify that we know what do we need to target? So what is really holding the animal back from reaching its genetic potential, which can be producing 500 eggs or having an FCR of 1.4 or whatever it might be. So we're not combining any plants and just see, will it improve performance, yes or no? So we identify the molecular targets and then we look into which plant metabolites, which combination of plant metabolites have the potential to influence these pathways. So, for example, one common challenge in broilers is subclinical chronic inflammation. So it's not super visible, but it really drains energy away. And also layers suffer from it because in broilers, it's mainly the selection for high growth. Because by doing that, we favor pathways that favor muscle development, but at the same time, that reduce the immune balance, let's say. So we neglect a bit that whole complex interplay of the immune response. And in layers, I think Roland very well explained the changes that the layer bird goes through. From rearing and then onstart of lay with all the transitions in feed and transport, all those processes, those hormonal changes, but also those environmental stressors, they can cause inflammation. So what we then again try to do with our phytocomplexes is influence in those pathways to make the animal, if you will, more resilient, less prone to that non-productive inflammatory response. So make no mistakes, we don't want to suppress the immune system because even inflammation, it's a necessary, a vital physiological process to injury, for example. But that non-productive inflammation is nothing good for. It drains energy away from production. And that is what we try to sort of rectify with phytocomplexes.
I've got to say, your Brussels sprout analogy is maybe one of my favorites. I was one of those kids that keep the stuff off my plate, Mom. Thank you very much. And then I discovered the magic of butter and bacon, and that made everything better. I'm going to start thinking. Maybe I'm going to start thinking of these phytotechnologies as the bacon to my Brussels sprouts. So let's dig into this a little deeper. How we put this technology into practice. I'm curious, and you started to allude to this a little bit as we talked about what the phytotechnologies do and can do. What's the role if we think about traditional medication or some of the traditional tools that we would use in the poultry health toolbox? What's the role some of these phytocomplex technologies, plant-based additives, play in enhancing or replacing or reducing reliance on some of those traditional tools in our toolbox?
They play a very vital role, but one message I want to get out there right from the start is we're not talking about replacing those traditional tools because they have their place. And I think it's very relevant to get that message out there because when I look around, a lot of the phytogenics or plant-based feed additives on the market are positioned as replacement for antibiotics. And we have a bit of more nuanced vision. So of course, by supporting the health and the resilience of the animal, we can actually reduce the need for antibiotics. But I'm very adamant that we are not replacing the action of antibiotics. So it's when an animal is sick, it will need treatment. And then then a phytogenic is not the right tool in the toolbox. But as a cornerstone of preventative health management, it has a vital role. So we need to start early before problems occur. And then they have great potential to make the animal more resilient and reduce the need for antibiotics. So a bit more nuanced. So it's not a black yes or no, but absolutely they have the place. So enhancing resilience, but not curing a disease.
I love that nuance. Animals are far more complex than a black and white yes, no, good, bad answer. And I think you explained that really well. Antibiotics certainly are part of the puzzle, but you also mentioned preventative medicine generally. So vaccination is one of those tools in the toolbox that supports animal health and performance. Is there anything you're seeing in your research where these phytotechnologies can, say, boost vaccine effectiveness in the broiler or layer space? Is there any kind of knock-on or synergistic effect there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, vaccination is one of the most important tools in our toolbox, and layers, rearing pullets especially, they undergo a multitude of vaccinations, just like our own children, most of them at any rate. And there are components, so metabolites that are part of our products that can help boost this immune response. So help to produce a more robust response towards or in response to vaccination, meaning that the animal will be better able to fight off the disease once it encounters the pathogen. And we've seen that also in other species, in swine and in ruminants, where, for example, the transfer of passive immunity is very relevant through colostrum, because basically the animals are born naive, immune naive, so they really rely on the antibodies, immunoglobulins in the colostrum, and basically same in birds that get their antibodies from the egg.
Thinking about this broader discussion, right, about disease management, development, getting the bird off on the right foot, building a strong immune system. You've painted a really good picture, and I want maybe to give you a chance to sum this up with a bow, Dr. Hambrecht, is how nutrition can help us slow or stop maybe early disease development in its tracks. I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit.
Yes, I really like the question because it really gets to the heart of what preventative health management through nutrition is. And would it be okay if I use calves as an example? Because it's one of my favorite examples and it explains very well the mechanism, let's say.
I grew up with cattle, so I'm never going to complain. If you want to go back to my roots and make an analogy, you're hitting it on all cylinders here. Brussels sprouts and cattle. Let's go for it.
So calves, they frequently suffer from cryptosporidiosis, which is a parasite, so links to coccidiosis. There's the first analogy with poultry. So one of our products has shown great promise on those farms. Why I want to use this example is because it really highlights the preventative approach. So not acting as a drug, but empowering the animal to fight off the disease on its own. So what that phytocomplex does is it enhances the production of interleukin-18, which is a cytokinin. So it's a messenger substance, let's say, of the immune system, which in its turn leads to a higher production of antimicrobial peptides. And these again, they fight the parasite. So while in the end, it might seem, okay, you give phytocomplex and then you have less parasites, so phytocomplex kills parasite. No, it's we help the animal to be able, we facilitate that it fights off the disease on its own. And we see less diarrhea, and I mean, the animal is really more resilient and performs better. So again, so not acting like a drug, but empowering the animal to defend itself more effectively. So that is the essence of resilience, I would say. And the same in poultry. Let's move to poultry. I spoke about inflammation. And again, the same principle. We need to be ahead of the problem. So we should not start supplementing at the point when we see the problems occurring, but start right before to prevent the problem from occurring. And that is in the first weeks of life. So especially, I mean, a broiler never gets very old, so it's a youth in all its life. But also with the layers, it's very important to get that rearing phase right, to start the young hen right in its production cycle. And there is where phytotechnology can play a very essential role in that preventative approach. If we zoom a bit out and looking at nutrition in a broader picture, there's of course more. And I think that is where Roland comes in again, because there's so much that can trigger inflammation, imbalances in the feed, environmental stimuli. And there is where nutrition can help to create those conditions that enable the bird, poultry in general, to perform well. So maybe Roland, I don't know whether you have something to add to that from a nutrition point of view.
Dr. Koedijk, yeah, that's great. I was going to come back to you with another question, but I'd love that Dr. Hambrecht opened the floor there. What are your thoughts on that broader nutritional picture?
Yeah, of course, nutrition is the entity of what the animal consumes, right? So we need everything is connected with each other, and it's either in complex forming or it is in the advancement of one nutrient to the other. So I think you can never look at nutrition with a singled out nutrient specifically and then expect an improvement or a disimprovement. So what Ellen is explaining also is on the disease improvements, right? So that's the analogy she used for calves or the improvements that we see on the immunity levels or the reduction of inflammation in laying hens or in broilers. All that has an improvement in performance, right? So the better we are able to counter those problems, the better the performance of those animals will be. And of course that has a link, and Ellen has explained it, with the different phytocomplexes that are available to help the animal in targeted situations. And of course that will increase and that will help the animal along the way.
While I've got you here, Dr. Koedijk, I want to ask you to pull out your crystal ball for a minute. This is something I always like to ask every guest on the show, is if you look into the future, 5, 10, 15 years, pick the time horizon that's appropriate for your research, what has you really excited about the future of poultry nutrition research? Is there a project, a study, a technology that just really has you buzzing with excitement now? What's maybe the next frontier you're watching in the crystal ball in that space?
Well, yeah, I think there are several. I think it's always nice to look at the future, and also the animal has become much more productive, or the laying hens can sustain a much longer production cycle, or the broilers are having an improved FCR or a reduced time to harvest. All those things come together, but I think the next frontier in poultry nutrition is not only precision, feeding the right levels. We get, of course, everybody is finding the optimal levels of the nutrients, but also digestibility, get more value out of the feed that you're using or that you want to use in the diet. And an important third is now sustainability. We see that has come in as a very important factor, depending a little bit on where you are in the world, but that is a big driver also, feed formulation, but also on how we actually feed these animals. So it becomes the third axis in which we formulate the diets right now. So precision nutrition will move from average-based diets, I think, to real-time, flock-specific, data-driven feeding systems. There's a long way to go, but I think that's a nice way to look into what is going to happen, or what are we looking into and what are we expecting for the future. Because if you think about it, there are many global nutrient requirement tables. Breeds have them, nutritional companies have them, we have them, but it rarely works that one table fits all the needs of all the producers around the world. So I see that we are getting much more precise. I think we are less and less going to rely on global feeding tables, and that we are going to be much more using all the different situations or the parameters that are important for that specific flock into the diets of those flocks. And then also, whether we're looking at broilers or layers, I think it's going to be in a similar futuristic way of feeding animals. So it depends on climate differences. It depends on raw materials that are available. It depends on the breeds they might have locally or what the expectations are of those breeds to do. So also disease pressures, knowledge of all kinds of molecules and blends and other ingredients, what Ellen was talking about. I think we are now much better capable in using plant-based materials or the phytogenic complexes for the benefit of the animal. And in the past, that was maybe much less the case. So we are going to use what we have available. Our knowledge will progress and will teach us more, and will identify opportunities along the way. But I think the real ones come down to the three things I said: precision improvements, digestibility improvements, and that can also mean raw material handling, or how to process raw materials and feeds in a better way so that the digestibility is going to increase, and the sustainability access. Those are the main ones that I think are expected for the future to develop further. And then I'm sure that when looking into the improvements over the last decades, like I said, I expect this to continue. So the animal will become more efficient. The animal will hopefully reduce the FCR. We get more out of what we are feeding. So the value out of a ton of feed is hopefully increasing. And along the way, we will get the animal to be more, they're better at withstanding pressures from outside. So that can be disease pressure, that can be a nutritional suboptimal situation where it finds itself in. So, or climate conditions that are pressing, and all those I think will see an improvement in the coming years to come.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way of going back to where we started the conversation of how we support that hen or that broiler, and nutritionally, that precision space is really exciting. We've had a couple great episodes over the past year talking about precision nutrition and precision production. So I would invite listeners to go back into the archives and listen to some of those previous episodes on the topic. I think it'll help connect some of those dots you're talking about. All right, last question for each of you. I'll put out one question. You can each give me your summary response here. But if you could ask the producer listening to this conversation, if you could give them a piece of advice that they would walk away with, maybe just one change to make in their nutrition program, one bit of advice that'll help them advance the game in this topic, what would it be? And maybe Dr. Hambrecht, will start with you.
Well, it very much depends on the producer and what their animal's main challenges are. But I would encourage them to consider phytotechnology as a preventative approach and move away from a simplistic view. There's a problem and I need a quick fix, but to look at it from a holistic point of view and see the role that phytotechnology can play in supporting animal resilience, together with nutritional approaches that Roland might now highlight.
Well, I was going to say, Dr. Koedijk, you get the last word on the topic. If you were, as a nutritionist, going to give one bit of advice to producers, what would you say?
Phytogenics is now very important. We know the impact it can have, but besides that, I think we should not underestimate the tremendous impact of rearing. If we are looking at the longevity point of view, everything is not curing problems, but avoiding problems. So the better you are in avoiding the problems, the better your flock will perform. And that Ellen's story is fitting in that very nicely. Also the levels of nutrients that are chosen and how you manage those animals in the house. I think it all comes down to avoiding the problems instead of curing them. And then the longevity will be the result of that.
Yeah, what a great recommendation and solid advice. As you say, regardless of your production system, making sure that bird gets off on the right foot and has the support they need. I think really good recommendations. Dr. Roland Koedijk, Dr. Ellen Hambrecht, both with Trouw Nutrition, thanks for joining us in this week's episode. Friends, it was great to see so many of you in Atlanta this week during the International Production and Processing Expo, or International Poultry Scientific Forum. Hopefully you had a chance to stop by our booth and interact with some of our Poultry Science Association staff members. If you didn't, you might have missed that we are deep into renewal season, so we'll invite you to go to our website at poultryscience.org. Of course, listen to some past episodes of the podcast while you're there, but maybe if you haven't yet taken the opportunity to renew your membership, this would be a good chance for you to do so. This episode of Unplucked was produced by Lindsay Johnston with editing and engineering by Michael Lunt of Parasol. For the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance. See you next week.